and the Basic Education Minister, Motshekga, says there's overwhelming support for the return to full-time classes from stakeholders, including teacher unions. Motshekga confirmed that unions have raised concerns over overcrowding as the COVID-19 pandemic remains a threat. For more on this, we're joined by Xolani, Fakude, Sadtu's head of secretariat, as well as Basil. Manuel, thank you very much to both our guests for joining us this afternoon. The Basic Education Minister had made mention that she had a meeting with unions and they were represented before this announcement, or more detail was presented to the nation today. Let me start with you, Basil, and maybe just ask your contribution or your input to that meeting in terms of what your members are faced with.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. The unions as a collective have raised very similar issues, and ours was about the overcrowding, which is a problem in many, many areas. Some places we see it because of the in-migration, others it's a historical problem, but that notwithstanding, it's a problem that must be resolved. We raised the issue of appointment of teachers, particularly when it comes to KwaZulu-Natal, and what we see as a floundering department, and we've even called for intervention from the minister because they haven't made appointments over 2 years. It's a tragedy if we bring children back and the learners themselves can't have a teacher in front of them. And then, of course, there was the story of books and supply of books, supply of PPE, to see that the whole system is ready. We've given our unqualified support for learners coming back, but that doesn't mean we are blind to the reality of the problems. We must remember that when we talk about overcrowding, we are talking about the township school. We are talking about the schools most disadvantaged. And those learners have had a raw deal, and to perpetuate this is unforgivable. So we want to see a plan on the table. And let's acknowledge the minister's undertaking, that this is being elevated not to just part of the general infrastructure budget, but a special project. And she's given us an undertaking, she repeated it on air, that she's going to Cabinet, she's going to Treasury, where she wants a special project made of the whole infrastructure issue. Because we know it's a moving target. There is damage being wreaked every year by weather. We see now over 1,000 schools damaged. So we can't wait before we start the project. So those are just some of the issues we managed to raise.
Xolani, let's come to you and maybe ask of your representations or your thoughts when you had the meeting. What did you put forth to the Education Department?
Thank you very much, Susie. First, let me greet you. Let me greet the viewers and my very good colleague, Mr. Manuel there. I think very much the manner in which really he summarized the input of collective labor is quite adequate. To be honest with you, as a union as well, we are quite concerned with the infrastructure challenges which we are still seeing right now. In fact, we are even clearer, and we are saying that it really cannot be acceptable that we should go back into a system that is still characterized by the crisis before even COVID. Remember, even issues such as infrastructure, by the way, these are long-standing issues, and we already know that largely we are going to be confronted by such challenges in provinces that are largely rural. This includes, of course, KZN to an extent. But then again, it also has to do with about the post-provisioning norms. I mean, we are saying that we need to get to a situation as a country whereby we make sure that in front of every learner there is a teacher. Now, we know that there are austerity measures that are being brought into the public sector through the back door. And I think also Mr. Manuel really referred to that even very briefly. What we're saying by that is that we are having a huge number of public servants that are not being absorbed by the system. And this is not just in education, but it is also in the other sectors as well. We've got the same crisis in health, we've got the same crisis in safety and security. But then what we said to the minister was that we need to make sure that at the very least, we try to deal decisively with the digital divide, because it is clear that what the COVID pandemic has really illuminated or exposed quite sharply to us as a country is the fact that we are still living in a world whereby it's still about the haves and the haves not. Others can continue when there are disruptions, and others they cannot continue. But then now, lastly, what we are saying also, and what we said to the minister was that whilst we acknowledge the fact that the 1 meter social distancing requirement has now been essentially removed. What is important, though, is that we should make sure that the non-pharmaceutical interventions can be implementable. And that goes directly also with how we also fund the schools for those kind of activities. There must be sanitizers, there must be enough masks, there must be thermometers that are working, and the list is ongoing. So what we are saying to do is that let us all work together, but nonetheless, as educators as well, we are saying that the rotational scheduling system did not really assist us. It was detrimental to the system. In fact, we were sitting on the verge of generational catastrophe. So it is in our interest, all of us really, to go back into the system as normal as possible and very quickly.
Basil, Mr. Fakude speaks of a generational catastrophe. He also touches on austerity measures that are brought through the back door, that we are sitting in 2022 still talking about this where, you know, schools are concerned. You touched on the fact that it's in predominantly township schools that we're talking about. What should this tell us?
There are a couple of important points, and I want to latch on to what Xolani said. When we talk about a generational catastrophe, the one is it's not just about returning to school and catching up. It's about the number of boy children in particular that have become disengaged. And disengagement very often leads to dropout. And the more dropouts we have, the greater the social problem we have a little later, because those same youngsters that today are enjoying not being at school become very, very disenchanted tomorrow. The whole issue about the long time it takes for people to see democracy in action, for them to see their sacrifices being rewarded by good schools is far too long. And these are the issues that are being foregrounded. But I also want to add that our children have been suffering because there has been no food, no adequate food. With so many people having lost their jobs, coming back to school starts filling that gap. So, Dudu, there are so many issues which we would like to lament about. But the unions have made a particular point, and I want to say as a collective, we've said, this is what we need now. We recognize the problems, but if we only focus on the problems and not also trying and addressing the continued losses, then we become part of the problem. So we have to say to the public, we haven't given up on the issues we've been fighting about, but we also need to see that we don't now become part of creating more problems going forward. Hence, we're supporting our kids going back. We're worried about our teachers. We're worried about the amount of time matric teachers have spent with matriculants in 2011. Their mental health, when they've got to do the same thing again in 2012. The sheer exhaustion, the lack of support when it comes to mental health issues, particularly because teachers have to deal with the problems of their children that come from home with problems that have not been attended to. So there's a myriad of things that we need to look at. It's not something we know that can be resolved overnight, but we've got to have a plan, and we want the plans on the table so we can hold people to account for not delivering.
Gentlemen, also joining us for this conversation is Mr. Sibusiso Malinga. He's the acting president of the National Teachers Union. Sir, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. So as you've been listening to what has been outlined, some of the problems that are plaguing the education sector in the country, just to pick up on the last point by Mr. Manuel, the exhaustion of teachers, mental health problems that they are faced with, saying that we are worried about teachers. What is the reality faced by some of your members?
Thank you so much. Let me greet viewers at home. But first and foremost, I must say that we as NATU, National Teachers Union, we have no challenge that learners should go back to school, because collectively the Department of Education, parents and teachers have an obligation to teach our learners because it's where we invest. However, we have a challenge because, you know, our teachers are very much exhausted because of many reasons. The first one is that the department has failed dismally actually to hire the substitute educators. So they've been stretched. They move from pillar to post trying to assist learners. Two is the issue of infrastructure. The issue of infrastructure has been with us for years. Before COVID-19, during COVID-19, even after COVID-19. Why? Because we do not have a sustainable solution in terms of infrastructure. That we bring in these mobile classes, they are not sustainable. They are not durable. And you know, they are very expensive. So if we do not actually invest in proper infrastructure, we're going to have a challenge. Two, the issue of COVID-19 regulations. Remember, the department, or should I say the cabinet, has decided to reduce the social distancing, of which is very worrying because we haven't heard that the president of the country has announced that our country now is COVID-free. So we are a bit worried about that as well. Water supply in schools. As we want all learners to go back to school, but those schools in deep rural areas, they are still struggling to get water. So we have also a challenge when it comes to that one. Remember, our schools are actually dilapidated because of storms and everything that happened in the last few months. And those schools are not yet fixed, while we say we want our learners to go back in school in full. Therefore, we say we as NATU will be on the ground as from tomorrow, trying to see if these things have been fixed. Hence, we say our learners should go back to school. But not that we are vehemently opposed to that, because we have an obligation to teach our learners as never before. Remember, COVID-19 has taught us that we need to work cooperatively, we as stakeholders and all other people who have interest of education in heart. Therefore, the call of NATU is very simple. Let's all, businessmen whosoever, let's join hands to try and assist, because lamenting won't assist us. But we urge that the Department of Education should look at the most disadvantaged schools. Schools in locations, schools in deep rural areas. You know what actually happens? We simply focus in the previously Model C schools. They have all infrastructure you may think of. There is also an issue of furniture that actually becomes a problem to our principals. So we have to look at all those things. Then we'll say, then our teachers will freely actually execute their duties.
Mr. Fakude, let me bring you into the conversation. We have seen some unfortunate scenes where school teachers are gunned down on, school property, where school teachers are abused as well by some learners on school property. This issue of security and safety at schools, are we addressing it adequately?
Actually, thank you, Eduduzile, for that question as well. And I must say that we fully, as such, also agree with some of the sentiments, of course, as expressed by Bob Malinga and Mr. Manuel. When it comes to the safety and the security in our schools, we have always said, what is clear is that there is a particular trend in this country. We are going to have all the nice policies, we are going to have the very nice sounding approaches and strategic documents, for instance, such as the National School Safety Framework, for instance. So once we have those, it is all about funding those. It is all about making sure that resources are adequate to make sure that some of those policies actually are implementable. For instance, this very same school safety framework that I'm talking about, it really does have the kind of information that we would even require ourselves as those who are in the school level. It has got the relevant information about early warning systems, about what is required, about what kind of surveillance systems, etc. It has all of those. The question is it implementable? Because at the end of the day, we are not going to put surveillance systems and metal detectors in a school that still has got pit latrines. Because then the question is that where then are our priorities? But now, what is important to do is that we need to really talk very, very strongly about parental involvement and particularly about community involvement in the life of the school. As a union, for instance, as Sadtu, we've got what we call a school fan campaign, which is really all about mobilizing all sectors of society to say that let us take a responsibility, let us take accountability, whether you are a learner, whether you are a parent, whether you are a community member, but let us take responsibility for what happens in the schooling environment. Because clearly, we've got to have a particular collective, kind of a collective approach and a collective discussion. We still are living in a country whereby in a community there are service delivery protests. They are going to go to schools and close schools as a form of a protest. Just now, when we're reopening schools for the coastal regions, we came out strongly about what we saw as schools being used as a bargaining chip in the Mkambatini region of KZN, and it had nothing to do with education. It was issues about traditional authorities. Now, what then says to do is that we need to then look at ourselves collectively as a country. We need a complete paradigm shift to say that to what level do we really place education as an apex priority? Because remember, the National Development Plan says that education is an apex priority. So it must be so, but not only in theory, but in practice as well. So yes, we are heavily concerned to do with what is happening in our schools in as far as our safety is concerned, because we're also saying that it demotivates us. We can't even recruit the numbers that we require in the profession, because education, or teaching rather, is being seen slowly but surely as a dangerous profession. I don't think that as a country we can afford to go that route.
Mr. Manuel, the conversation has had a rather heavy tone when we talk about the state of basic education in the country. I would like for us perhaps to highlight some really great stories and great work that has been done where the education space is concerned in South Africa, particularly those schools that do not wait for government intervention and yet they're producing stars.
Absolutely. You know, Duduzile, it's almost a tragedy that focuses always on the negative when there are so many good things that happen. Would we have the type of pass rate we had in Motshekga? And the pass rate is not the only thing to look at. If we didn't have a whole lot of good people making huge sacrifices and doing wonderful things in terrible circumstances, we wouldn't have it. We wouldn't see all the good performance that our learners are achieving if we haven't had the good stories. There are many schools in the poorest of our areas, in the Eastern Cape, in KZN, in Limpopo, and I'm highlighting them as the rural provinces, where parents have ensured that the school ablutions are upgraded and built. There are so many examples. Unfortunately, whenever we talk, we are focusing on the things we don't have as opposed to the many things we have. There are many companies that have helped us ensure that we have better connectivity in our schools. And connectivity is an important issue today. We want to see our schools moving into the 21st century. We want to see our children skilled differently to be prepared for the 21st century technologies. And if it weren't for good individual people and companies and parents who work for those companies, who put pressure on the companies to do things, we wouldn't have a lot happening. So I want to assure you, as well as our many listeners, that there are many good things happening. I don't want to repeat the things Xolani has said. Notwithstanding the fact that we want more parents involved, there are thousands of parents who give up selflessly to ensure that their schools function. And this is what we want to see. We want to see more of it. But certainly, there's a lot of good things happening out there.
Let's continue with that feel-good theme. But Malinga, perhaps let's come to you and talk about what some of the teachers who are faced with the most adverse circumstances do just to make sure that learners show up on time, there's discipline, and there's learning.
Oh, yes. You know what? Maybe let me start from that one of safety and security. It was so unfortunate that the department has decided to say when the security guard in schools that were actually employed, when they retire, they are no longer replaced. Then it's a challenge on its own, because we need to start it from there. We as NAT, we once said we would love to have enough security in our schools. We even said that we proposed the ratio to say at least for 200 learners, there must be one security. So now you know what is actually happening. Our teachers are attacked day in and day out. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry now harasses our educators, of which is very challenging and demoralize our educators to execute their duties as they could. Two, the issue of learners coming on time and everything, that actually should be dealt with us collectively, because teachers cannot enforce that. Let's have parents. We need parental involvement, maximum involvement of parents, to make sure that schools are functioning very well. Because all of us, we have a responsibility to raise these actually learners, to make sure that they become the citizens of the country that will push our country forward by the time actually goes on. But we cannot do that if we do not come, all of us. We join hands together and we move together, because our government has said, as my colleague has said, that they put education of our country as the priority. So let's see the department also doing that in action. There is also an issue, my leader, that I want to touch on. The issue of admin clerks in schools. We also need to make sure that should they retire or even should they die, we need to make sure that we replace them. We understand the issue of money, issue of budget, but we need this support staff if we are really concerned about the education of our learners in the Republic of South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. A closing thought from Mr. Xolani Fakude. Please do correct me if I'm wrong. South Africa's constitution is 26 years old today. Do you perceive that 10 years from now, 5 years from now, we'll be sitting here speaking about the same problems that are plaguing the education sector in South Africa? Or, given what Mr. Manuel has said and what Mr. Malinga has said, will make great strides?
Duruzile, we remain a very optimistic union. And our optimism also is really informed by the fact that we do have got adequate platforms to continuously engage with major stakeholders such as the Department of Basic Education, for instance, and continuously really raise some of the issues that we want to highlight. We are saying to do that we are indeed optimistic, and we believe that this is the same attitude that we should all apply as a country. However, our optimism must also be accompanied by a sense of responsibility and a sense of accountability by all of us, and not just the government, by the way. Very recently, we had the Learners Organized Commission, COSAS, going to the Johannesburg Stock Exchange to demand that let the corporate sector also play a decisive role towards how we fund education, because ultimately this is the human resource that they require for their own companies. So we are saying that let us work in a collaborative manner. We all need each other. And we believe that if we can really work and have that open door policy amongst other stakeholders, we will indeed, let us have that optimism, we will indeed at some point reach that particular target that we so much desire.
Sadtu, Head of Secretariat, Xolani Fakude. Basil Manuel is the Executive Director at Naptosa, and Mr. Sibusiso Malinga is the Acting President of the National Teachers Union. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your indulgence this afternoon and for availing yourselves.